open it up now to the, yes, Lindsay. All right, but we're going to give you a microphone. Yes.
There we go. Look at this.
Introduce yourself, please.
Swarming microphones over here. I'm Lindsay Church. I saw most of you yesterday. I have a question about, two questions kind of. So I am running a small nonprofit for minority and underrepresented communities. Like, I'm really worried about, it's now 2022, and people are starting to shift their strategies, like larger organizations who have done large amounts of harm in communities, and they're now starting minority programs. And so how can feedback, I saw the eye roll, or was that an eye roll? I'm guessing it was. But now I'm seeing organizations that literally in the midst of 2020 were accused of anti-Black racism now having food pantries in minority communities. And so how can feedback be used to strengthen the feedback that's coming into funders? Because there's an intermediary and a filter, basically. Like, nobody wants the bad stuff to come up, so how can funders hear directly from communities? And I think, Veronica, you pointed at diverse tactics. Like, I think that's important, is how do you get your ear down all the way down to the ground? And then two, can funders hold each other accountable to really pushing this feedback, and not just feedback from large organizations now starting to realize diversity is a thing that they should care about, but to empower organizations that have started that way, that really have been prioritizing this feedback the whole time, and they just didn't have the right language for it, because feedback isn't like the normal word I would be using, input or conversation, like how do we shift that narrative and framework to empower young grassroots organizations and communities to be able to do more, rather than empowering large organizations that already have a lot of resources and have done harm to do more.
Okay, really good questions. And Lindsay, you're going to hold us accountable for answering them the way that you want us to answer them and be thorough. Would someone like to take Lindsay's first or second question? You can restate the question too so that we can track. Well, we know which one you're answering because there are two different questions.
Yeah. I'll just jump in
right.
real quick.
Go, Kelly.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. I'm not going to take a long time, but there's a project that I worked on, actually the first one I worked on at Irvine, cavoices.net. We built a website instead of a PDF report so that it would live and people could learn from it. But it really was about going to the ground to listen directly to people. Using human-centered design, which we heard a lot about on yesterday. The neat thing that happened in that space was us being a part of community in a room like this, at tables, sitting with, not standing above and saying this is what we need you to do or how we need you to do it. It's going to the ground with principle and understanding that we are not the experts in the room. When we go to the community, the indigenous wisdom, the folk that work and worship and play and raise their families in those communities, they're the experts. And so if we go in humility and are listening to those stories, there's going to be some hard things that we hear. Some folks are going to come at us like, where were you when? All of those kind of things. But when you come in as a part of and you are listening on the same level, we didn't get as much. We got some, but we didn't get as much. Where have you been, and why are you coming here now, and why do you care, and why should I share? I've done this sharing over and over and over again, and nothing has changed. And so it's going in one time and coming back out and saying, I got it, and now I can go do something. That's harmful to communities, particularly communities of color, which have so many broken promises already. And so being careful about which communities and the why. I said this at the funder dinner on Tuesday night. If we understand the why behind it, as long as we're not going in just to make ourselves feel good and for us to pat ourselves on the back or check a box that we went and listened, if that's the reason, just don't do it. Just read a report. But if the reason is because we're trying to develop authentic relationship with community and we understand that the community experience is not my experience and I'm new to this and I'm going to learn and grow from this personally as well as professionally, then that's a good why and a place to start.
Veronica.
All right, I'm going to take the analytical approach. So I've been in the philanthropic space for about 15 years now, and I've worked primarily for large global philanthropies. And so, Lindsay, to your question around intermediaries. I always find it really interesting as a person of color that did not come from the nicest places in the US and that has a whole large immigrant story to getting to where I am today. I always find it really interesting when we as funders talk about how we need to listen to our grantees because our grantees represent the communities that we serve. And not to say that they don't, and not to say, because I've worked on the nonprofit side, but there are a lot of disincentives that we've talked about earlier, to not actually telling the donor, the partner, the funder that things are not as great as they should be. There just is. And Feedback Labs actually did, some of us were part of a learning lab type of experience over the last 2 years where they started to unpack those incentives. What would it take for grantees and partners to actually be able to say something different? And yesterday I thought there was a really good point that made me think about it analytically from a focus group and community convening perspective. And I think it was during, Lindsay, the panel that you were on. There was this note about how the evidence shows that if you have more than 2, max 3 people in a room, you're not going to get authentic feedback. And I also got this personal feedback because I teach at Columbia University, this class on measurement. And I used to ask my students, my 25 students, every class, what can I be doing better? Is there anything that we want to be doing more? And the feedback that I got in the evaluation surveys was, you're not going to get actual feedback if you're asking all 25 of us. So again, that highlights that individual person, because if you have to talk to different people, that's a whole other issue. So a solution piece. So when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I knew all of this information, the reporting, the evaluation, it's all based on self-reported data. And because the incentives aren't aligned, how can I know for sure as a donor whether or not resources are actually being received? And they're being received to the people that are actually, that we're saying we should be receiving it, and that they think it's a good thing. So for a little bit of time, we were talking about tech-enabled solutions, and that was before the pandemic, where we were like, tech-enabled solutions, they could be extractive, they could be all these things, which they are, they can be all those things. However, during the pandemic, it proved itself to be helpful because we couldn't travel, we couldn't actually get to communities. So how are we going to gather information about what was actually going on in the field, in the ground? We, at the Rockefeller Foundation, we tested a couple of different approaches. They were low cost, which made them more scalable. So you can get to more people's voices and perspectives if you're using some type of tech-enabled solution. And we tested a couple of different tools. One of them was using Viamo, who used to be Voto, which is kind of like getting robocalls. We never pick up the robocalls, but we were like, maybe we will. Let's test it out. Many of our partners work in Africa, so we got to tailor the question. Because most of the questions are being designed by an evaluation firm or an evaluation team that sits somewhere really far from the community. It's not necessarily accessible. Another way that we tried it out was using 60 decibels. And 60 decibels is also a mobile data collection service, but they do something different, whereas Viamo would automate the question, so you can ask max 10 questions, max or responded to via SMS or pickup phone. 60 decibels will actually call a person. So I think the voice-to-voice interaction is important. However, the key point there is, so we tried new things, and what we found out all kinds of other things. So first of all, and I could talk about my funder because I'm not that funder anymore, we found out that in some places, resources weren't even getting there. We had a large bias towards believing that the communities that we were serving were primarily women. We found out that is not true. But we did find out that for the people that did get the resources, that they were seeing some level of benefit. And for us, that was sufficient to answer the question around, is this intervention working? right? And we didn't have to do a large evaluation study in order to do that. We were able to kind of do a little bit of a litmus test, like check in more often and ongoing. And to me, that really proved the case that, you know, while I respect my partners, I respect my grantees, I've been in the intermediary role before too, nothing is as important as actually getting constituent feedback. So for me, in my new role, that is what I'm going to work on building out, is how do we really align to what our partners need, but also how do we know whether or not we're doing anything good or bad in the universe by asking those end users. And while I sit very, very, very far away from the communities that we're serving, that's my challenge, and that's what I bring to the table. Like, how do we push our culture and our principles to get to actually listening to the people that are most affected by our choices?
Thanks, Veronica. So Lindsay, I realize we didn't totally answer your first question. I mean, I think just the reality is that now that equity is like the flavor of the year, I had this conversation yesterday with a bunch of folks, like how do we ensure that being equity-centered is not just, okay, check box, we are doing it, and also that it's so frustrating to see organizations that are primarily white-led that are claiming this as their thing now, and they're then garnering more resources to do their work, as opposed to that money going towards BIPOC-led, BIPOC-serving organizations. So, I mean, that is a challenge to philanthropy that we as Fund for Shared Insight are trying to make. I think it's a hard thing, and that's why you got the little eye roll that maybe didn't make it to the video. But as part of your second question too, I think if I captured this correctly, about shifting the narrative. So how do we shift the narrative about the importance of truly listening, like Kelly was talking, going to the ground, listening to people in communities in authentic, non-extractive ways, closing the loop, having equity at the center of how you're listening and how you're responding, engaging community and coming up with the solutions that they're suggesting need to be made, shifting power to people in communities to lead organizations, whether it's the nonprofits, funders, right? When we talk about informing grant making at funders, strategy development, one of the sort of other areas is thinking like, what would it look like if foundations, boards of directors, their trustees, were more representative of the communities that are at the heart of their work, who have that lived expertise to bring. So it's not people like me, frankly, even, who are sitting in my office making decisions about grants that have nothing to do with my lived expertise. I'm not in the community. We just recently finished a round of grants that we did in a participatory grant-making initiative in climate justice as Fund for Shared Insight, where we engaged individuals across the country with lived expertise in climate justice. And we had a couple people from Puerto Rico that I had the pleasure of meeting with, along with Ariadna, when I was in Puerto Rico recently. But they were making decisions about who should get what funds because they know the community. They're in the community. They represent those entities in some cases. And one of the individuals shared with me, he's like, I love that we get to choose our champions. And that quote just really stuck with me because I thought, you know, what would it look like, right, for the community to choose who should get the most funds, who should be designated by the funders as the leaders in their field to do the good work on the ground. I think we get very different responses if it wasn't this paper, enter into flux your grant proposal, and then someone, frankly, like me, making decisions about something that I know nothing about or I know something about from a very academic perspective. So it's been very humbling for me being a part of this and just thinking about, again, how do we shift that narrative to people and communities in a way that is representative, that is respectful, where we're truly listening to the ground. Kelly?
I just want to add one more potential resource for you all. The Skillman Foundation from 2006 through 2017, I think, 11 years, did something called the Good Neighborhoods Initiative, and I had the pleasure of being one of their community building consultants to help design and facilitate that process. And the process was very similar to what Melinda was talking about, is creating governing councils in community. So community could be the keeper of the vision. Now, you talk about some work. It was so hard and so rewarding. It's the most enriching experience of my career to have been in Detroit. I tell people my DNA is a part of the comeback of Detroit, as we started that work before a lot of the other big things that were happening in Detroit at the time. But the neat thing about it was really going to community, large sessions, all the different languages, facilitation. It was just a massive process in 6 different communities. But here's the lesson. Even though we had 6 communities representing the most vulnerable young folk in Detroit at the time, even though the process was the same that we tried to implement in each place, when you went to one community, you went to one community. You could not pick up what you did in Southwest Detroit and go to Brightmoor and do the same exact thing, because there was a uniqueness and a customization that had to happen, because the people in that community are different and they wanted different things for their kids. And so there's definitely a lesson in the listening and the understanding that even when we have process, we have to be willing to shift and change process when we go to the ground to speak and work with community. And so Skillman.org, in their evaluation section, they actually talk about that whole process. And one of the strongest things they did was create a resident small grants committee that did exactly what Melinda just talked about.
All right, so we have one question there, one question here, one question here, one there, and then do we have virtual questions, Eliza? All right, we don't want to neglect our virtual participants. Everyone wave to our participants. Hey, so sorry you can't be with us. All right, name and organization, please.
Yeah, I'm Chiokimos Telesfor with Corporation for Skilled Workforce. Used to work for City of Detroit's Workforce Development Office, and I just wanted to add on that Skillman Foundation created a youth advisory committee where they get to give $100,000 every single year. And I think that was born out of that core work that they did. So.
Great. Question over here. Name and organization first.
My name is Barry Whittle. I'm with Keystone International, formerly with PSI, that some people might know. This was really a great, great way to start the day. And in fact, I think we could spend a whole day on this kind of stuff. And I just wanted to share some of my experiences that I've had over the last 25 years with funders, and not specific funders. I think
you could name them.
But I think,
oh, sorry.
I think you represent a more enlightened, group than I'm used to dealing with. But I would actually say I've suffered from getting too much feedback from my funders in the past. And I'll describe
feedback from funders.
From funders, and let me describe, and it relates to your thing about not paying for travel. Now, basically, I end up having 20 donors generally to run a program, because one won't pay for travel, so then I got to find one who pays for travel. I got to write a report to the one who pays for travel, and then to the one who doesn't pay for travel, and the one who won't pay for the secretary, and the one who won't pay for the wheels on the car, right? So now I got 30 reports. They all go to a program officer. They're usually young, ambitious, quite smart. So they get the report, and they come back with 30 questions. Very, very difficult questions to answer, because they're smart, right? And I've got local staff, from all over the world. English is not their first language, who are struggling, spending weeks answering those 20 questions. And sure enough, they come back with another 20 questions. I've had that experience over and over and over again, where it becomes a full-time job for my program staff just to feed the feedback. And so there's something wrong with the funding model in the charity world in general. I would argue it should work more like the corporate model. You have to pay for the if you're going to invest in a company, you got to pay for everything. You agree what the bottom line is, what the mission is, and there's one report that goes to all the donors, and you all have to pay your own fair share of everything. Period. It may be this giving circle thing. I'd like to learn more about about what that means. And finally, I really wanted to agree with the point about proof of impact. Like what I've gone through for the past decade is what we call the age of compliance, where we have invested such an enormous amount of money into financial accounting and financial auditing practices, it has consumed an enormous amount of money, time, and angst, and even mental energy on behalf of program staff or country leaders, just to check the box, to make sure somebody has a hotel receipt when they went on a trip, right? You can run a program that gets a perfect audit that never once delivered one service to a client. Mm-hmm. We have very poor systems that can prove that that client that I wrote in that nice little report, or that nice little hotel voucher that I claimed that I went to, that can prove that actually I reached the clients that we wrote in that report. And I would argue that is really where a major investment needs to go, and to how can you create ways of directly communicating with consumers or recipients of services to ensure that they were exposed to the service, used the service, what they think about this service. That's really where this all needs to go, and collectively, I would argue.
So just a couple of responses to that. For your last point about how do you ensure that people are receiving the services and that they are collecting feedback, that's what this whole initiative, Listen for Good, that Kelly was talking about does. Is we've heard from almost 200,000 individuals about their experience receiving services from direct service nonprofits and how they've experienced that using a Net Promoter Score to use the corporate application. And then there's a whole movement in philanthropy that I've been part of for more than 2 decades now, and it's making a little more traction around the importance of general operating support grants, multi-year investments. There's a whole thing called trust-based philanthropy that people are glomming onto because it makes sense. Like, you trust the nonprofits, and we're extending that in our work at Fund for Shared Insight. You trust the nonprofits, and you trust the people in communities to know best what they need. So you're not nickel and diming, you're not asking for these reports on your expense. You're saying, like, we trust that you'll use the money in ways that the community needs, because we know, because we're asking and we're listening, that you're listening to community and that you are responding to the needs on the ground of people in communities most marginalized by systemic racism and injustices. All right.
Can I speak to that real quick?
No, Katie. Oh, sorry, Katie. And then, did you still have a question? Oh, we skipped you. Sorry. Yeah. You're after Katie.
Oh, after, okay. So this is also super quick follow-up on the last question. The best way to promote anything typically is to role model it. And if we think about feedback on application and reporting processes, Fix the Form project came out late last year with the insight that 40% of all proposals are asking exactly the same questions. And the grantee feedback that it would be really nice to have a common proposal form, which could embed a question on listening. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, so I have something that I'd like to say about that, because I think it comes down to communication, right? And so I exactly have lived your experience, and I know that frustration from the nonprofit side. I know it also from the funder side, because sometimes you ask all kinds of questions and you don't even need that information, and then you have to spend the time reviewing it, and the last thing we want to do is look at receipts. And when I first started working 20 years ago in philanthropy, I hand added up all those receipts. We don't do that anymore. I really do believe in the common application. We've struggled with that in our community since I've been in this field. But I'll give you a really great example, and there's some funders in this room that are part of this example. We had the privilege of being invited to the table. There was a group of nonprofits that were working on how can we work better together and how can we have shared services, and they developed one of the most phenomenal programs that I was blown away, right? And Melanie Patz is here, and she really led that effort, and it was great. And all the funders were there, and we said, we want to support this because this is amazing. But everybody needed to communicate, like, well, what can I do? What's my part? What am I willing to give up? What can I, support? And one of the funders really just could not give up their application that, by the way, I would say is comparable to a federal application. Mm-hmm. It is more information than you could ever have. And so that's when we said, wow, yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? And so we said, well, what we can do is we'll pay a consultant to write your application for you. Would that be helpful? And they're like, yes. And then some of the other funders, we said, and we'll accept that application and we'll fund it too. Mm-hmm. So it was such a great experience of how we asked nonprofits to collaborate, and they did, but then the funders collaborated too. And there's been a few examples of that, and that's powerful. And that is a win-win for everybody.
A story I love to share from Fund for Shared Insight, because we raise funds from our donors, our funders. There's 10 national funders, but then we are giving them out, those grants. And we have one member of our team who actually works for the Hewlett Foundation, but she also works on Shared Insight. And she was filling out the applications for the other funders. And when the other funders found out that another philanthropy program officer was filling out their application, they were horrified and said to Lindsay, "What do you mean you're filling out our application?" She's like, "Well, who do you think fills these out anyway?" And I think they were so ashamed because when they realized that it was a peer funder that was going through that terrible flux system and the word count and the letter. I mean, it was like it was like ridiculous. And they changed because they were so ashamed, and they brought that back. I'm sure they weren't the first people, but when they heard it from Lindsay at Hewlett that this is a pain to fill out your application, it was a wonderful moment. All right, so now we're going to hear from here, and then make sure that Lori also gets a question in.
Good morning. My name is Sanjay. I am from Seoul, Colombia. I come from Colombia. And I have to say, I hear you and I think, wow, these are like really cool funders. But I have to be a little bit honest and say, my experience is far away from you guys, very far. And in Colombia, South America, like, this does not happen. And it's impossible to have this kind of conversation. And I can tell you, I've been applying for grants for the last 7 years. And I've just gotten my first one last year, and it was like, wow. And there is where you realize that this is a conversation where it's not a conversation. It's a one-way thing in which a nonprofit has to learn to write applications in the language and in the form that funders like to hear, independent of whatever they do. It doesn't matter what you do. What matters if you can write things, and this has been studied, no? So we talk to consultants and friends, and they say, yeah, you have your average rate of success is you have to apply to 20 so you can get one, and I'm like, I've applied to 100 and I've gotten one. Like in October, I would have said I've gotten none. And that's where you think, like this conversation which we're having here is like a world which is very far away from a lot of the world who is trying to do stuff and who needs the funding to do the stuff, no? So I always wonder what it is that sort of creates equity nationwide, worldwide, and what creates equity in terms of how you're in the US, and I came to the US, and it's like a big effort for me to come to the US, and then you realize it's not the same for somebody who lives in Jacksonville to participate from this, and then you say, how could we really understand what worldwide equity means and how we can work on it? And it has to do with where the money is in the world, no? So we've been looking for money abroad because in Colombia people don't have a philanthropy culture, no? So they don't give it out. So it's a very tough way to get your ideas through. And then when you realize it, it's easier for people in the US to understand what I do than for people in Colombia. When I say what I do in Colombia, they're like, wow, that's a bit weird. We're not going to fund that. We're going to go for the classical things, which, no, the conventional things which supposedly work. So a little bit, my question would be, you've tried cool stuff and you do awesome stuff. How would you imagine making this really spread in an equitable way throughout the planet? You know, it's not easy.
Small question. Thank you, Sanjay.
Could I jump
I
in?
want to say congratulations on your grant, but also, like, oh, how painful is that? And hope the reporting requirements aren't like super onerous, because that's the other.
Melinda, can I jump in on this?
Yes, go ahead, Veronica.
So, you know, I do lead with data, and so I do, to your point, from Keystone Accountability, and to your point, we met in Puerto Rico, I remember. So, philanthropic, I don't know how many people watch the philanthropic dollars worldwide, but philanthropy collected by the OECD, which collects all development finance, which is what this work is, it's development finance. All of philanthropy, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation dollars, is 5% of all the money that's going out for these types of projects. So 95% of all of our resources, primarily going to various different countries in the economic development scale, including the US, in communities, comes from government. So the reason why you have multiple compliance-oriented types of processes out there is because of the way government finance is set up. So with that said, I just want to put that out there because we are so small, philanthropic capital is so small, and what we are good for is to try new things. We are risk capital, we're flexible funding, we're all these things, but the challenge with philanthropy worldwide, because I work worldwide, is that we have no accountability mechanisms. There's watchdogs, there's best practice, and if you ask any philanthropy, we will tell you there's no best practice, there's a lot of good practice, and feedback is one of those good practices. But setting that aside, just being able to know that actually just justifies the system that we're in. It doesn't necessarily make it right. It just justifies it. And so for the comment here around the universal grantee application form, I think universally that's a great thing. Getting many different philanthropies to align to that is a movement building piece. And the way that we change the system is by bringing on people with that lived experience to the system to be those decision makers. So representation really matters. And so I would just say that right there. Just put that aside for a moment. In terms of making it a little bit more like feedback for learning versus feedback for compliance, because any good thing can be turned into a very bad thing. I would say, right, anything, because it creates, like, who are we asking for? If we've been talking about feedback as time, we're asking for the people with the least amount of time for more time, right? And so it sounds good, but is it? And so challenging ourselves to come up with some equitable ways, to Melinda's earlier point, about being able to change that philanthropic model is part of the work that many of us do. And so I say that because as someone on the other side, you might not experience that, as the colleague before was mentioning. The other piece to it is the reality is, even in collaborative funding mechanisms, I've learned this because I've tried this from so many different angles, somebody's got to drive. Somebody always has to drive. And so it's on us to make sure that those drivers are probably the ones who are going to get to a more equitable process. And a good point in time, a good example on this is...
And Veronica, I'm just going to ask you to keep it brief because we have one more question before we...
Got it. Is we work with indigenous populations and tribal nations. And you can ask me all kinds of reasons for why we do. We're now evaluating those processes, right? You know, one of the pieces that I'm kind of thinking about always is, how do I make sure that we are evaluating and we're taking a world view and decolonizing our own processes so that we're not being extractive and we're coming from the north and being like tribal people. Please tell us all the 50 things that we really need to know. Right? How do we ask them what would be effective decision-making and collaboration? And I often think that that sometimes is part of the solution, perhaps not for Columbia right now, but part of the solution is us challenging our own worldviews, because we're all biased and we're all trying to convince you that our approach is the right approach. And there is no right approach, as the world is diverse, and to get to equity, it really takes us all to change our mindsets, which is part of the culture piece and part of the listening for good and fund for shared insight approach. Is how do we walk our own talk so that we're not imposing our worldviews on you, and you're then imposing those worldviews on the people that you're trying to engage.
Last question from Lori. Oh, Lori from Hewlett. Now you don't have to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lori Grange from the Hewlett Foundation. Quickly, I worked with Lindsay Louie for 8 years, and that is so Lindsay. And Kelly, that means I worked with Faye Tversky for 8 years, and if you could say hi to her on my behalf, but I want you to say hi in this way, Faye, Faye, Faye. So that's that. So I wondered if, the question is, could you talk a little bit more about the closing the loop? What does that look like concretely to come back to grantees and let them know what you did or what you didn't? Because sometimes, at least for us, sometimes grantees have conflicting suggestions, or sometimes the feedback is just as earnestly as you might want to adopt it, it can't work for some legitimate reasons. So if you could talk about closing the loop, that would be great.
Right, and in 90 seconds, go.
We closed the loop. We closed on the loop on the project with Irvine in a radical way. We invited all of our grantee partners that helped us go to the ground, plus our CEO and our entire leadership team, those that were on our team, into a room for a full day. We used a firm to make sure that all that we heard across the state was up on the walls, and we engaged in radical dialogue about what was there.
Ooh, less than 90 seconds. Excellent. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Kelly, Veronica, Kathleen. And thank you for being such an engaged audience. We really